Hello, welcome to week 2, Sociology of Crime. My name is William Wood. This week we are looking at how sociologists measure or count crime. So our lecture today, Measuring and Researching Crime. The first part of the lecture, which we'll do today, this lecture, is focused on measuring crime, looking at things like official data, victimization data, self-report data, etc. The second part of the lecture, which we'll do in the next shorter mini lecture, looks at crime factors. The third and fourth part of the lecture will be in part 3, or the video of part 3, crime patterns and trends. Let's go ahead and get started. So when sociologists talk about measuring crime, they're almost always talking about quantitative data. Quant means a number, or quant refers to things that can be represented in numerical format. Quantitative data is useful descriptively if we want to understand things like distributions, but most researchers use it for inferential reasons, that is, making inferences about larger populations. This is done through representative samples, and you'll be looking at this either last year or for most of you this year in your quantitative methods class, in your statistics class. Other criminologists do qualitative work. Qual means word. Here we're interested in things that people tell us about themselves, so attitudes, beliefs, etc. So here we're less interested in making inferences about larger populations, more interested in looking at how people understand or interpret crime. Some sociologists use what are called mixed methods approaches, particularly if we had a bigger project. Let's say we wanted to understand the intersection of things like drug use and educational background. We might use surveys. We could also use interviews. We would look at student data, etc. So it'd be very common in research studies such as this for sociologists to use both qualitative and quantitative data, or a mixed methods approach. What we'll be looking at today in this first part involves crime data. Two types of crime data, official and unofficial. Official refers to crime data that is collected and disseminated by official or governmental agencies. This includes things like crime rates, arrest rates, so on. Also includes things like crime control, so referrals, convictions, sentencing. Unofficial data refers to anything that isn't collected by official law enforcement or similar agencies. So this includes victim survey or victim data. It also includes self-report data, as well as some other type of research data that we'll discuss towards the end of this lecture. Official data comes from governmental agencies. It's used to measure crime and crime control. Arguably, the best known of this data is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. This has been going on since the 1920s. Every year, the FBI collects data from over 17,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in the United States. It compiles them, and then it releases them to the public, to researchers, etc. Also, I forgot to mention in the lecture last week, there is, throughout my lecture notes, throughout the term, anything that's underlined is a hyperlink, right? Oftentimes I use hyperlinks to link you to, in this case, the Uniform Crime Reports. Other cases I might use hyperlinks when the research is available online. So please make sure to follow those because in a lot of sense it'll help you understand or flush out or make sense of what I'm talking about in a way that takes you to the direct source. In Australia, crime data is recorded by the police, compiled and reported by the Australian Institute of Criminology. Again, there's a link there. Criminologists use official data in 3 forms: raw data, data per 100,000, and as percentage data. Overwhelmingly, the preferred method of presentation is data per 1,000 or 100,000 because it allows us to compile rates. Rates are far more important than raw numbers. If you tell us there were 2 murders in your city last year, that doesn't tell me anything. If I find out your city has a population of 5, well, I'm not going to go to your city. Or if I find out your city has a population of 5 million, I might want to move to your city. It's a fairly safe city. In your essays, you should endeavor whenever possible to not use raw data, to find corresponding rates. Right? As for percentage data, which is sometimes used, percentage data is just an inversion of rates. So if you have percentage, you should be able to find some measure of rates or vice versa. Today, criminologists still use and rely heavily on official data. However, there are several problems or limitations in terms of reporting practices, in terms of problem or differences in law enforcement practices, in terms of methodological problems in the reports themselves. So problems in reporting practices, our knowledge of this comes from victimization data and other types of data that have shed light on some of the problems inherent in reporting practices for official data. For example, victim survey data suggests that some crimes, particularly crimes that are shameful or have stigma attached to them, fraud, for example, white-collar crime for some victims, obviously some types of sexual offenses, might be underreported at a ratio of up to 20-1. Reasons that people might not report crimes to the police include lack of trust. Many communities, there's a lack of trust in police, lack of belief in efficacy. Okay? Even if there's not necessarily a lack of trust, there's a lack of faith that anything will be done about it, particularly for smaller offenses. Right? Somebody sideswipes your car, or somebody steals your wallet. You think, well, the police aren't going to put a lot of effort into this necessarily. Fear, right? We're talking about fear of reprisal by offenders on victims. Things like domestic violence, family violence in particular. Culpability, being from the United States, about twice a year, inevitably, somebody gets really high and then calls the police because somebody steals all their dope, right? I've often find this funny as a criminologist because there is, with particular types of offending, especially, high overlap between offending and victimization, right? It's called the offender-victim overlap, funny enough. So in many cases, or most cases, however, when people are culpable, they are reticent to call the police. Shame, we already mentioned shame as a possible reason why people aren't likely to report offenses. And finally, subcultures. This is the old adage, snitches get stitches, or better summed up in a really well-known song by that band NWA. If you don't know what song I'm talking about, feel free to email me and I'll send you the link. Different police departments have different formal and informal rules and regulations regarding the recording and reporting of criminal activities. And this leads to differences in enforcement practices. We're not saying the enforcement practice itself is necessarily a problem, but it's a problem when we want to turn those practices into usable data. So these differences include things like urban, suburban, and rural. Rural policing historically has tended to be much more informal, less likely to report offenses, particularly minor offenses. There's often a higher likelihood that the officer knows the offender or the accused, and that's dealt with, off the books. This is the thing, catching college kids at a party in the middle of nowhere, making them dump their beer or, whatever. Policing strategies and philosophies, right? In particular, the difference between beat cops or police that walk or use other ways of interacting on pedestrian level, and patrol units, right? Historically, patrol units arise from middle and upper middle class neighborhoods, particularly in the United States, other countries, where people wanted to have the police easily accessible. They didn't want the police to be living or close by, and people don't like being watched, but they like having the ease of access of police. And this creates a very different relationship where police become far more reactive. Right? I'm sure for those of you that have taken policing, this is all quite familiar. But it does create differences in enforcement practices that in turn can make significant distinctions in reporting practices. Finally, methodological problems, reliance on accurate census data, more of a problem in the United States and Australia. Australia historically has had a fairly accurate census, the United States less so. The methodological reasons for that are somewhat beyond the class. But you cannot have accurate reporting without accurate census data. That's what I want you to take away from this. Also, the question of what counts as crime. This is something we looked at last week. And who defines what is crime? Examples, domestic violence, which for decades, up until quite recently, was thought of as a family matter or a private matter. very often not recognized by law enforcement, or even in many cases justified or legalized through state or federal law. Up in, as recently as 20 years ago, there were a number of U.S. states that didn't count things like domestic violence or rape as separate crimes within a context of a marriage. So again, this takes us back to our discussion last week, what counts as crime. A particularly odd one example here as well, the Uniform Crime Reports up until 2011, not counting male rape as a crime. Female rape could be, statistics could be counted, but by definition, oddly, men couldn't be raped. There was no category for it. The FBI was, roundly criticized for this, hounded in some ways until they capitulated on this. And uniformity, which I discussed in the previous slide. Okay, so offender data is the kind of first category of data that criminologists look to when they want to look at things like crime rates, crime trends, etc., how we know what we know about crime. The second type of data we move into is this unofficial data, victimization data. Victim surveys, widely seen by criminologists as a redress to some of the problems of official data. While no reporting method is without its problems, victim surveys, as we already mentioned, reveal that many more crimes are committed than are ever reported to the police. This is called the dark figure of crime, or the long recognized problem in criminology that much more crime exists than is ever known to authorities. All right, so whoever came up with this notion of dark figure of crime, this is cute, right? Because it's somewhat analogous to the problem of dark matter. Namely, that the vast majority of matter that exists in the universe, we know it's there because of its gravitational pull and effects and everything else, but we can't see it, right? Just like we can't see directly the vast majority of criminal offending, but we know from indirect measures that it exists. So remember this term, it will come up on one of your assessments. So the most well-known victimization survey is the National Crime Victimization Survey. This huge undertaking done every year where 50,000 American families are recruited. They're asked to pay attention to particular things, and then they're interviewed and surveyed at length every 6 months or so over a 3-year period, right? So this has yielded an enormous amount of data on crime victimization. Australia has only more recently started to systematically collect and record victim data. Queensland has a periodic victimization survey as well, and Australia also participates in the National Crime Survey. As with offending data, there are some problems with victimization data. Overreporting and underreporting both occur for different reasons. There's a link there that goes a little bit more into the problems of overreporting and why. Methodological problems with sampling reliability can also be an issue. If you want to know more about that, ask your stats lecturer. I'm sure he or she will be happy to unpack that for you. Second type of unofficial data that's used with some frequency is self-report data. These are surveys administered to sample populations that measure attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and demographic data. Almost always anonymous insofar as their usefulness depends on the assumption that participants' identities will not be disclosed to law enforcement, teachers, whoever else might be an issue. So this is central to the way that criminologists measure unreported criminal behavior, particularly things like substance abuse, domestic violence, or other things that are often hard to measure directly. Also useful in the evaluation of what the criminologist Larry Siegel has called the distribution of criminal behavior across racial, class, and gendered lines. So self-report surveys started informally, started in the 1940s, gained some popularity in the 50s, more predominant in the 60s. By the 1970s, they're used with regularity. They found a markedly broader distribution of crime across socioeconomic strata than is reflected in official data. One of the first examples of self-report surveys was done by a college professor who went out and got a sample of offending data from local police on juvenile delinquents. And then he surveyed, or provided a survey to his own college students. What he found was quite interesting, that his college students had very little actual reporting reported offending, but on the whole, they reported being involved in delinquent activity more than was recorded in their official data, less than delinquents. But what the larger recognition was is that while lower class delinquents tended to have their offending captured more accurately, middle class and upper class youth tended to get away with more bad behavior without it ever being captured as offending. So this is what I mean when they say found a markedly broader distribution of crime across socioeconomic strata than reflected in official data. The reason for this is fairly straightforward because official data doesn't measure crime as a social phenomenon. It measures policing, right? So particularly 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, there was a high degree of belief both within police as well as society that crime was largely a lower class phenomenon, right? So it was the lower class that tended to be more heavily policed. Self-report surveys also have methodological problems. Validating respondents' answers, this can be done in some cases, but there are problems okay, so those are two separate things. Let me slow down. Validating respondents' answers, which can be done in some cases. It's beyond the kind of, it's beyond what we're focused on this week to discuss how we methodologically verify, but there are some approaches to this. The second is problems of variance in terms of how people interpret questions. Particularly earlier self-report surveys tended to use language that was often confusing or ambiguous, right? So these surveys, because they're being administered in an anonymous setting, have the highest likelihood of being misinterpreted, often because there's not anybody there to help explain questions, right? So for example, when the National Crime Victimization Survey is administered, there's somebody who's speaking to the victim or victims to help explain questions when things aren't understood, and so on. Sampling problems, and this problem, which is an interesting one to self-report data in particular, those with the most to lose, meaning those with the most serious crimes or committed the most crimes, are the least likely to answer honestly. This becomes significant in particular when we consider that much of violent crime is committed by a smaller number of individuals, right? This is recognized by research from Marvin Wolfgang forward. Wolfgang in particular, this is a term you should know, the famous 6%, where Wolfgang and his colleagues looked at a youth cohort in Philadelphia. They looked at several actually, but the first one they looked at was about 10,000 young people. They found over many years, over progression to adulthood, is that only about a third of these 10,000 had any type of contact with police. Now, out of that third, only a third had second contact. And out of that third, only a third had 3 or more contacts. So what happened in the long run out of this cohort of about 10,000 kids is only about 6% of them were responsible for a majority of violent offenses and almost an equal number of property offenses. So 6% responsible for well over 50% of the entire offending of the cohort. This is where we get the notion of the chronic offender, the repeat offender, the criminal career, so on. Right? Well, so the problem stands that if these people are responsible for such a high number and they're not answering honestly, then we're not likely to capture an accurate measure of self-report offending from a population or subpopulation that is most involved in that offending. Australia has no general or comprehensive self-report survey on crime. Several studies, however, in Australia use this method. The best known, the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, there's a link to it there. Finally, let's talk a little bit about other types of data. We can talk about cohort research. This includes longitudinal and retrospective research. I had already mentioned cohort research in terms of Wolfgang's work. Experimental research, the most famous of this is the Stanford County Prison Experiment. We're doing a great read later in the term on our week on trait theories of a study called Being Sane in Insane Places, where a sociologist and some of his colleagues checked themselves, this was many years ago, into mental hospitals reporting hallucinations, but once they were in the mental hospital, they acted normal, and they tried to get a sense of whether or not their daily activities would be interpreted as sane or insane. You'll have to read the article to see how it turns out, but it's definitely worth a read. Observation and interview research. So here we're getting into things like ethnographic research or more prolonged interview research, meta-analysis and systematic review, data mining, and crime mapping, and there's a link to crime mapping. Okay, so this concludes our first of 3 shorter lectures for week 2, and please stay tuned for the next section when we look at crime factors and some patterns in relationship between things like age, gender, economics, etc.